I know I don't have to tell any student of mathematics, let alone any teacher of mathematics like yourselves, that there's a big difference between learning math and learning how to teach math really well. There's a big difference in what we would call mathematical content knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge. The ways in which we have to store our mathematical understanding in order to effectively teach it to learners, it turns out can be quite different than the way we need to store that information in order to sort of perform mathematical tasks for ourselves. And that's kind of one of the themes, I hope, of all of the courses that you take in your master's program for teaching mathematics. And sort of navigating the difference between those two things is a relatively new invention, but one of the pioneers of this distinction was Felix Klein. Yeah, that Felix Klein, the famous mathematician from around the beginning of the 20th century. So he wrote in 1906 a series of books called Elementary Mathematics from an Advanced Standpoint. The three editions, the first of which is called Arithmetic, Algebra, and Analysis, that I've drawn a lot of inspiration for our course from this text. It's well worth picking up a copy. What I am constantly struck by in reading this now more than 120-year-old text is just how ahead of his time Klein was in thinking about that difference between knowing mathematics to be able to do it and understanding mathematics to be able to teach it, and just what are the best ways to organize material and create tasks to help learners grasp new mathematics for the first time. So a large part of what I hope that we do together this semester is read some of what Klein has had to say. Some of this reading is a little bit challenging because it's old, but there's a lot, like I say, of contemporary wisdom, and there are a lot of questions that Klein in Germany was grappling with in 1906 that we are still, in 2024, wrestling with in our own American math education system today. So to get us started, the first reading that I have on deck for us is from the introduction as well as a second section in this book that relates to what Klein sees as the historical development of mathematics. And here are two of the important themes that I want you to be sensitive for when you read through this. The first is that in his introduction, Klein talks about what he calls a double discontinuity, which is a fancy, very mathematician-speak way of saying that when you prepare to become a math teacher, you undergo these two big shifts in your experience of the educational system. The first one is the shift in going from the high school classroom in which you're a student into the college classroom in which you're a student. So that transition from high school to college is an inflection point for how students learn math and kind of the philosophy and how they're presented with material, what's being expected, and just sort of the stakes go up a little bit in that transition for all students from high school into college. But for future math teachers, there's a second discontinuity that happens when they go from the college classroom in which they are learners into the secondary classroom in which they have to be teachers. That second discontinuity is the one that's really particular to becoming a math teacher and developing that sense of how your mathematical identity and your teacher identity come together to create the best professionalizing experience for you as an educator and the best learning environment and experience for your students. And so Klein thought about this a lot in his own experience, and he worked a lot with future math teachers in Germany at the time. And so he's got a lot of thoughts in this introductory section about the nature of those two inflection points, that double discontinuity that uniquely math teachers experience in their educational journey, and whether there might be ways for secondary teachers and university educators to work together to kind of smooth that pathway out. In other words, to help more of today's secondary math students to want to and successfully become future secondary math teachers. So that's the first lens that I want you to have in mind as you're reading through Klein's excerpts this week. The second, Klein launches into a fairly lengthy seeming, although it only covers about 8 or so pages in this small volume, a history of mathematics. So it doesn't really stand in for a full history of math text. But what I think is interesting about the way that Klein recounts this history of math is that he creates this dichotomy between what he calls a plan A way of understanding development of mathematical thinking, and a Plan B way of understanding the development of mathematical thinking. And the difference between the two are what you might think of as a depth-first approach versus a breadth-first approach to teaching math. So one way to think about this might be with reference to our own educational teaching frameworks for Massachusetts public education. So in the frameworks document, this is the one from 2017, there are all of these conceptual categories of standards for mathematical content: number and quantity, algebra, functions, modeling, geometry, statistics, probability. And in each one of those conceptual categories, there's smaller learning standards within each one, right? And so, according to Klein, Plan A, so to teach a student this material according to Plan A, you would go into one of these conceptual categories, like number and quantity, and then you would drill down on that conceptual category. You would learn the properties of exponents really, really well, and then you would shift and learn about the properties of rational numbers. And so it's very much a pick a topic and you really focus down on that topic intensely. And then only after you have mastered that topic do you then move on to the next topic. So it's a depth-first approach in Plan A. And according to Klein, as you'll read, he sees a lot of the historical development of not just math, but how math gets taught in the schools as really privileging Plan A. There's a lot of drill and kill and drill down and really focus in and master one thing before you move on to the next thing kind of philosophies. But Klein's Plan B, and you'll notice pretty clearly as you read him recounting Plan B, is completely the opposite. Rather than drilling down on each conceptual category one at a time, you try to present material and develop material for students and for yourself that emphasizes the interconnectivity between the different conceptual domains of the subject. So rather than just learning number and quantity topics on their own, at every stage you're connecting, all right, how does this thing that I'm learning about numbers connect to something else that we're learning about algebra? How does that connect to something we're learning about functions? And what are the threads that unify the different conceptual categories together? According to Klein, this is a more engaging and rich way and provides students a lot more, let's call it intellectual scaffolding on which to hang each new topic that they're learning about, because they see the ways in which it's connected to all the other strands of their mathematical thinking as they're developing. Now, I don't want us to fall into the trap of thinking that these are two mutually exclusive ideas, Plan A and Plan B. I think that as you look through your own lesson plans and your curriculum in your schools and the way that you present materials in your courses, you'll probably see some fingerprints of Plan A and some fingerprints of Plan B at various places along the curriculum. But I think it's really interesting to see how Klein is pulling this out of his experience in, late 1800s, early 1900s Germany teaching, and how we see echoes of this all the way through to the present day. Those of us who were around in the late 1900s and early 2000s, like myself, will remember something called the Math Wars. The Math Wars are kind of where we saw the first modern kind of schism in between math teachers and curriculum experts that prefer the traditional curriculum of learning algebra and then learning geometry and then learning trigonometry and then learning analysis and calculus, versus another strand that they called at the time the New Math, in which these integrated math curricula began to develop, where in Integrated Math 1 you learn the basics of algebra, the basics of geometry, the basics of analytic geometry, and then you took it up a step at the Integrated Algebra 2, and then Integrated Math 3 took it a level higher, but at every stage, again, you're emphasizing those connections between the two rather than learning each subject in a box in isolation. So Klein's Plan A and Plan B have reverberated through history in a variety of different ways, and we still see them present today. So as you're reading through this first reading, I want to introduce you to the tools that we're going to use in order to carry out discussion of this material, because it's one thing to just read something, it's another to have the opportunity to bounce it off of one another and really get a whole lot of different perspectives on what's going on to help you sharpen your own thinking. So what we have is sort of two places where I want discussions to happen. The first is the one that's linked directly from our Blackboard page. It's a tool called Perusall. Perusall is a social annotation environment. What that means is it has the reading inside of it. So this is all transcribed directly from Klein's 1932 text with the help of a ChatGPT optical character recognition bot, which was kind of fun to use. And so the idea behind Perusall is, as you're reading, I want you also to be processing, thinking, connecting this to your own experience. I've suggested some potential questions you might think about in the Perusall assignment itself. And as you find a passage in the reading that you want to react to, either add your own reaction, your own comment, pose a question to help kind of extend what's going on there, all you have to do in Perusall is just highlight the passage. And when you highlight the passage, a little window pops up where you can add your own comments and submit them, either by pressing enter or clicking on the submit button. When you do that, your comment becomes visible to everyone else in the class that then comes in and sees this later. So if you're one of the first ones to read the passage, everything you're going to be doing is an original comment of your own. If you're coming to it sort of later on after some people have already added some comments, in addition to adding your own comments, I would also recommend jumping into other people's comments and adding your responses to their comments to kind of initiate these little conversations happening within the margin of the reading that we're all doing together. So that's the first place. The second place would be within our Discord site. So in Discord, if you jump into our reading chat channel called Reading Chat 596, this is a good place to, again, sort of continue the conversation just by responding to whatever questions you might like to pose to your classmates that are not necessarily specific to one passage within the text that we're reading, but might be sort of general. So if you have general questions to kind of bounce off of one another, Reading Chat on Discord is a great place to do that. So we won't do a ton of readings from Klein, but we will do a few because, again, I think it provides us with a really valuable frame on what we're studying together this semester. And I want to just close with a caveat or two about your experience of reading Klein. It's an old book. Even though the ideas are quite modern, sometimes the language is a little bit old-fashioned, so allow a little bit of extra cognitive load processing time to get through. He's a pretty good writer, but it definitely feels a little bit archaic at some points. And one of the most archaic things about it is you'll notice that when Klein refers to other students and teachers of mathematics, he always uses male pronouns for them. No excuses, of course. It was not an accident of the time, but it was sort of deliberately constructed history in ways that female teachers were excluded from the training and from the franchise. So just be aware that that was the context in which Klein was writing his work. And of course, for today's, if this were to be rewritten today, the choices of gendered pronouns, I'm sure, would be quite more expansive and inclusive now that we have everyone teaching mathematics to everyone, as it should be. So I hope you find as much interest in Klein's writing as I have. Like I say, we're going to be reading a few different things from Klein over the course of the semester, and so I hope it goes well. If you have any questions about the tools themselves, how to use them, feel free to reach out to me on Discord. I'm happy to help out with that. In the meantime, I'll see you in the margins of the text on Perusall, as well as in our Discord reading discussion channel.